In the vast, open heart of Texas, storms were nothing new. Folks had grown up watching the sky darken and the wind twist the plains into wild, howling beasts. They had built homes to withstand the fury, planted deep roots into stubborn soil, and learned to wait out the rage of nature. But this storm was different. It started as a whisper on the horizon, a low hum in the sky that made the cattle restless and the dogs bark long before the first drop fell. The clouds were blacker than night itself, rolling and churning like a living thing. By noon, the wind had turned savage, ripping shingles from roofs and tearing fences from the earth. By sunset, the town of Dusty Creek looked less like a home and more like a battlefield. Windows shattered, barns collapsed, and in the chaos, fear spread faster than the storm itself. Families huddled in cellars, praying their walls would hold. Mothers clutched their children close, fathers nailed boards over windows with shaking hands. Everyone was trying to survive. Everyone except Eli Carter. Eli was a cowboy, not the kind you'd find in dime store novels, but the real thing. He'd been raised on the saddle, his boots worn smooth from years of riding the open range. His hands were calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind. Life had taught him hard lessons early, that the land didn't care about you, that storms didn't listen to prayers, and that strength wasn't in how hard you could fight, but how much you refused to quit. When the storm hit, Eli could have stayed put. His ranch lay on the outskirts of town, a small patch of land with a barn sturdy enough to hold against the winds. But as he stood on his porch, watching the sky split open with lightning, a breathless rider came pounding down the muddy trail. Eli, the young man shouted, rain streaming down his hat brim. The Reynolds baby, she's sick. Real bad. Fever won't break. Doc says she needs the medicine from town. But the bridge is gone, washed clean away. Eli didn't hesitate. How far? 8 miles. Maybe 9. But the roads. I'll get there. Eli cut him off. There was no bravado in his voice, just quiet certainty. He saddled his mare, Dusty, a strong chestnut with a steady heart, and tied the leather pouch of medicine tight against his chest. The wind screamed around them, and the rain turned the ground to rivers of mud. But Eli didn't wait for the storm to pass, he rode into it. The first mile was the worst. The rain came down sideways, soaking him to the bone. Dusty stumbled in the muck, but Eli urged her on. Branches snapped like gunfire overhead, and lightning clawed at the sky. He leaned low in the saddle, eyes narrowed against the stinging rain. Most men would have turned back. But Eli wasn't most men. He thought of Mary Reynolds, the young mother whose husband had died in a cattle stampede last spring. He thought of her baby girl, barely a year old, her tiny chest rising and falling with shallow, fevered breaths. And he thought of the promise he'd made long ago, that as long as he had strength in his body, he'd never stand by while someone else suffered. The trail grew worse as he pushed deeper into the storm. A swollen creek had swallowed the road whole, and he could barely see the opposite bank. Eli dismounted and waded through waist-deep water, leading Dusty by the reins. The cold bit into his bones, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Halfway across, a log slammed into his legs, nearly knocking him off his feet. He staggered, almost losing the pouch. But Dusty pulled forward, her strength anchoring them both. Together, they clawed their way to the far side. Another mile, and a fallen tree blocked the trail. Eli pulled the reins, guiding Dusty around the wreckage, weaving through tangled roots and broken branches. Every muscle in his body ached. His hands were numb. But in his mind, he saw a little girl's face, pale and sweating, and a mother's eyes filled with fear. And so he rode on. By the time he reached the Reynolds cabin, night had fallen. The storm had not weakened. If anything, it roared louder, as if furious that one man dared defy it. The cabin door burst open as he approached, and Mary Reynolds appeared on the porch, lantern in hand. Eli, she gasped, rushing toward him. You came. He swung off Dusty and pressed the medicine into her trembling hands. It's all here. Get it to her fast. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Eli said softly. Just take care of that little girl. Inside, the baby whimpered weakly as Mary prepared the dose. Eli stood silently by the door, watching as the child swallowed the medicine. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the small cabin, a fragile calm settled over them. Hours passed. The fever broke before dawn. When the first pale light of morning crept across the soaked earth, the storm had finally moved on, leaving behind a battered but unbroken world. The town of Dusty Creek emerged from cellars and barns, shaken but alive. News of Eli's ride spread quickly. Of the cowboy who braved the storm when no one else would, who crossed rivers and fought the wind to bring hope to a mother and her child. They began to call him the Rider of Hope. But Eli Carter never thought of himself that way. When asked why he did it, he only shrugged. A storm's just wind and rain, he said. It's what you carry inside that matters. And maybe that was the truth of it. Because strength isn't about how much muscle a man has or how many battles he's won. It's not about standing tall when the sky is clear. It's about riding into the heart of the storm when others turn away. It's about carrying hope, even when the wind tries to tear it from your hands. For Dusty Creek, that storm became more than a memory. It became a story they told for generations, about the cowboy who rode against the storm and delivered more than medicine. He delivered faith. He delivered courage. And most of all, he delivered hope. The storm was angry that day, the kind of storm that turned the sky black before noon and made the earth itself tremble. Wind howled like a living thing, ripping branches from trees and hurling them through the streets. Sheets of rain hammered rooftops, filling the gutters until rivers ran where roads had been. And in the small frontier town of Red Hollow, fear took hold. People had weathered storms before. They had seen floods and lightning, watched barns collapse and fences vanish underwater. But this storm was different. It was fiercer, heavier, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash the town away. And in the heart of that chaos, a single cry rose above the roar of wind and water. The children. They're still in the schoolhouse. All eyes turned toward the far side of the river, where the little red schoolhouse stood on higher ground. Dozens of children were trapped inside, too far to hear, too small to save themselves. Between them and safety, the Red Hollow bridge swayed under the weight of rising water. The wood groaned. The ropes snapped one by one. It wouldn't last much longer. Panic spread like wildfire. Mothers screamed their children's names. Fathers rushed toward the riverbank, only to be thrown back by the surge. The sheriff shouted orders no one could follow. The bridge was too unstable to cross, and the current below was a death trap. But amid the noise and the terror, one man stood still. Jack Carson. He was a rancher, known for his quiet strength and stubborn heart. The kind of man who spoke few words but meant every one. Jack had seen storms before, and he knew fear was a dangerous thing. It froze a man when he needed to move. And now, more than ever, Red Hollow needed someone to move. Jack turned to the sheriff. I'm going. Jack, you'll be swept away. The sheriff shouted over the wind. That bridge is coming down. Then I'd better hurry, Jack replied, his voice calm as ever. He saddled up his old Mustang, Copper, a horse as loyal and tough as the land itself. Then he grabbed a thick coil of rope and tied it tight around the saddle horn. One end he looped around his waist, the other he anchored to a sturdy oak near the riverbank. If the bridge fell, he wouldn't be swept away, at least, not easily. With rain stinging his eyes and wind clawing at his hat, Jack urged Copper forward. The horse balked at the first step onto the bridge, hooves slipping on the slick boards. The water below churned angrily, smashing debris against the wooden supports. But Jack leaned low, whispering to Copper, and together they moved on. Halfway across, a plank snapped beneath them. Copper reared, and for a heart-stopping moment, man and horse teetered on the edge of the abyss. Jack gripped the saddle horn and kicked forward. Somehow, they made it across. On the far side, the children's faces appeared in the schoolhouse windows, pale, wide-eyed, terrified. Their teacher, Miss Clara, opened the door as Jack rode up. Thank God, she cried. I didn't think anyone could get through. We don't have time to thank God yet, Jack said, dismounting. We need to move, now. The bridge was weakening by the minute. Jack could hear the ropes snapping like gunshots above the roar of the river. He lined the children up, tying them together with shorter pieces of rope he carried. One by one, he led them back toward the bridge. The first crossing was the hardest. The children cried, clinging to Jack's coat as the bridge swayed beneath them. But he kept his voice steady and calm. Eyes on me, he told them. Hold the rope. We'll get there together. And they did. One group at a time, back and forth Jack went, through the wind, through the rain, through the rising water that lapped higher with every trip. His hands tore open from gripping the ropes. His legs trembled from exhaustion. His soaked coat clung to him like iron. But he never once thought of stopping. Each time he returned to the schoolhouse, fewer children remained. Each time he crossed back, the bridge grew weaker. Planks vanished beneath his boots. Gaps widened. But hope, fragile and stubborn, kept pushing him forward. On his final trip, Jack carried the smallest child in his arms, a little girl no older than 4. The bridge shook violently beneath them now, screaming under the weight of the river's rage. Halfway across, the main support cable snapped with a deafening crack. "Run!" someone shouted from the far bank. But Jack didn't run. He walked steady and sure, whispering calm words to the crying child in his arms. "Almost there, little one. Almost home." With a final surge of strength, he stepped off the bridge and onto solid ground. The moment his boots hit the mud, the bridge gave way behind him, torn apart and swallowed by the raging river. A stunned silence fell over Red Hollow. Then a cheer rose, rolling through the crowd like thunder. Mothers wept as they held their children. Fathers clapped Jack on the back, their words choked by emotion. Miss Clara hugged him fiercely, tears streaming down her face. That night, when the storm finally broke and the stars returned to the Texas sky, the people of Red Hollow gathered in the town square. Lanterns were lit, not just to chase away the darkness, but to honor the man who had faced it without fear. They called him the Cowboy of Hope. The man who had crossed a dying bridge again and again, carrying nothing but courage and a promise that no child would be left behind. Jack didn't see himself as a hero. When someone asked him why he'd done it, he only shrugged. "Because someone had to," he said simply. "And hope's not worth much if it stays on one side of the river." Long after the storm was gone and the river returned to calm, Red Hollow remembered that day. And they told their children, and their children's children, about Jack Carson, the cowboy who stood against the storm and showed them that hope isn't something you wait for. It's something you carry, even when your hands bleed and your legs shake. It's something you become, when everything else falls apart. And sometimes, hope looks like a cowboy, soaked to the bone, smiling as the bridge collapses behind him, because the children are safe, and that's all that ever mattered. The plains had always been hard, but never like this. For months, the sun had blazed mercilessly over the land, turning rich pastures into fields of dust. Rivers shrank into thin, lifeless streams. Cattle died where they stood, and crops withered before they could grow. Hope, once as wide as the Texas sky, had become a rare and fragile thing in the town of Iron Creek. But drought was only the beginning. One afternoon, as the horizon burned with a strange orange light, the wind shifted. It began as a low, uneasy whistle, then built into a relentless howl that swept across the empty plains. By dusk, the air was thick and heavy, and even the birds vanished from the sky. Old folks whispered that they hadn't felt a wind like this in 50 years, not since the Great Storm of '72, the one that had wiped 2 towns clean off the map. This storm, they said, would be worse. Panic spread quickly. Families packed what little they had left, unsure where to go. Farmers prayed over brittle fields. Mothers held their children close as the first distant growl of thunder rolled across the land. And at the center of it all stood a man named Marshal Cole, quiet, steady, and unshaken. Cole had lived his whole life in Iron Creek. He had worn many titles over the years: rancher, lawman, neighbor, friend. But more than anything, he had become the town's rock, the man who spoke little but acted much, who faced disaster with a steady gaze. Folks said Cole didn't just endure storms, he walked through them like they were nothing but weather. So when fear took hold of Iron Creek, every eye turned to him. Cole was already preparing. He walked the length of Main Street with a list in his hand and purpose in his stride. At the general store, he loaded wagons with flour, canned goods, and water barrels. At the livery, he checked saddles and bridles, making sure every horse was ready to ride. And at the edge of town, he met with the ranchers to round up the scattered cattle before the wind could scatter them farther. "Marshal," an old farmer called out as Cole rode past, "you think we'll make it?" Cole paused, his gaze sweeping across the barren fields. "We will," he said simply. "But only if we move." The storm was coming fast. The sky turned an ugly, bruised green as lightning danced across the horizon. Winds tore at the rooftops, and the first sheets of rain hissed against the baked earth. Cole knew they didn't have much time. "We head for the high ridge," he told the townsfolk, his voice rising above the howl. "It's solid ground, storm won't reach us hard there. We'll bring the cattle, the wagons, everything we can." And so they moved. Families climbed aboard wagons packed with what little remained of their lives. Ranch hands pushed terrified herds forward. Children clung to their mothers as the wind roared around them. And at the front of the long, desperate line rode Marshal Cole, his broad-shouldered horse ranger cutting a steady path through the chaos. The journey was brutal. What should have been a 2-hour ride stretched into 6 as the wind fought them every step of the way. Dust stung their eyes, rain soaked their clothes, and more than once, the wagons threatened to tip over in the mud. At one crossing, a flash flood swallowed the road, forcing them to wade waist-deep through churning water. At another, a frightened steer broke from the herd, nearly trampling two men before Cole rode it down and turned it back. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice hoarse but unshaken. "The ridge is close." Hour after hour, they pushed forward. Cole never slowed. Even when exhaustion gnawed at his muscles and rain blurred his vision, he stayed at the front, guiding, shouting, riding back to help those who fell behind. By midnight, they reached the base of the ridge. It wasn't much, just a rise of solid ground crowned by a stand of old mesquite trees, but it was high and strong, safe from the worst of the floodwaters. The settlers set up camp, tying the cattle in tight circles and building windbreaks from their wagons. And still, the storm came. It hit with a fury Iron Creek had never known. Thunder cracked like cannon fire. Walls of rain hammered the earth, turning lowland roads into rivers. Wind screamed through the night, tearing apart fences and flattening what few crops remained. In town, roofs were torn from homes and barns collapsed like toys. But on the ridge, the people of Iron Creek endured. Cole rode the perimeter again and again, checking ropes, calming cattle, keeping spirits from breaking. When a wagon wheel splintered, he was there with his hands and hammer. When a child cried out in fear, he was there with a quiet word and a steady presence. And when the worst of the wind struck, he stood tall in the rain, his coat plastered to his frame, watching over the town like a sentinel carved from stone. Hours crawled by. Dawn crept over the horizon, a pale light struggling against the storm's fury. And then, slowly, the rage began to fade. The wind weakened. The rain eased. The thunder rolled farther and farther away until only silence remained. The storm had passed. One by one, the townsfolk emerged from their shelters. They looked around, dazed but alive. Their cattle were safe. Their wagons still stood. Their children were in their arms. They had lost much, barns and homes and fields, but they had not lost each other. And at the center of the ridge, soaked to the bone and coated in mud, sat Marshal Cole on his horse, hat low over his eyes, watching the horizon. A murmur swept through the crowd. Someone started clapping. Then another. Soon, the ridge echoed with cheers and shouts, tears and laughter. They had survived, and they knew why. They looked at Cole and saw not just a man, but a message. Hope is strongest when carried on the back of courage. Later, when someone asked him how he'd done it, how he'd found the strength to ride through that storm and lead them all to safety, Cole just gave a small, tired smile. "It wasn't me," he said. "It was all of us. I just showed the way." But they knew better. They knew that without Marshal Cole, his calm voice, his steady hands, his refusal to surrender, Iron Creek might have vanished from the map that night, just like those other towns before it. Instead, it endured. And from that day forward, whenever dark clouds gathered on the horizon and the wind began to rise, the people of Iron Creek would remember the man who led them through their darkest storm. They would remember the last ride, not just as a story of survival, but as proof that courage, once set in motion, can carry an entire town on its back.